A mother's worst nightmare isn't losing her child. It's discovering that he's the monster she's been searching for. Monica Brooks had always been a woman of unwavering faith, a mother who carried the weight of her son's burdens as if they were her own. She had spent nights praying over him, whispering reassurances that no matter what life threw at them, she would always stand by his side. And then Alyssa Carter was found dead, a bright young woman with a future ahead of her, taken in a way too brutal for words. The crime sent shockwaves through the city. People locked their doors, whispered theories, pointed fingers. The police promised justice, but the case stalled. Leads ran cold. Monica refused to stand by in silence. She was the first to organize the vigils, the first to call reporters, the first to beg the public for answers. She stood on national television, pleading, voice breaking under the weight of her grief. Whoever did this, please, turn yourself in. The world saw a mother drowning in sorrow, a woman demanding justice for a life lost too soon. What they didn't see was the truth, because justice meant turning in her own flesh and blood. When detectives finally uncovered the truth, even they struggled to find the right words. Because how do you tell a mother that the killer she has been searching for has been sitting at her dinner table all along? Atlanta, Georgia, a city that never sleeps. But in the summer of 2019, one home in the heart of the city became silent. Too silent. The kind of silence that follows something unspeakable. It started with a missing girl, Alyssa Carter, 22 years old, a promising college student, full of life, full of dreams. Until one night, she simply disappeared. Her mother called. No answer. Her job waited. She never showed. At first, it seemed like an accident. Maybe she left town. Maybe she needed space. Maybe there was an explanation. But 2 days later, there was no more room for maybes, because in a small apartment on the west side of the city, Alyssa Carter's body was found. She was lying in her bed, her sheets soaked through with blood. The scent of death thick in the air. No forced entry. No shattered glass. No struggle, except for the marks on her wrists, the defensive wounds on her arms. The attack had been quick, precise. And one thing was clear, this wasn't random. This was personal. The question wasn't just who had done this. The question was, who had she trusted enough to let in? The police worked tirelessly. They retraced her final hours, checked her last phone calls, interviewed everyone who had seen her that day. The evidence pointed in every direction, except the right one, until they found it. One detail, one clue, the message, 3 simple words, sitting in her phone unread. We need to talk. It was the last thing she ever received. And the sender? Someone the world never suspected. Someone who stood in front of cameras, mourning her loss. Someone who held candles at vigils, crying with the crowd. Someone who was supposed to love her. Someone who had been right there the whole time. Her best friend's mother. A woman searching for justice. A woman grieving alongside the family. Monica Brooks. But she wasn't searching for the killer. She was raising him. Because the DNA at the crime scene, the skin beneath Alyssa's fingernails, the blood-stained hoodie buried deep inside a closet, it all belonged to her son, the boy she had nurtured, the boy she had prayed over, the boy she had sworn to protect. And in a moment that would forever define her life, she had to face a question no mother should ever have to ask. What do you do when the person you love most is the one who took everything from someone else? What do you do when the very justice you're fighting for means handing over your own flesh and blood? The truth was coming. The truth no one was ready for. And when it finally unraveled, even the detectives were left speechless, because no one saw it coming. No one, except the woman who had spent 24 years raising the monster she never knew lived inside her home. The weight of grief is unbearable. It crushes the air from your lungs, paralyzes your mind, leaves you grasping for something, anything, to make sense of what has been lost. For Monica Brooks, the grief was suffocating. Alyssa Carter had been like a daughter to her, the girl she had watched grow up, the girl who had shared countless dinners at her table, the girl who had once laughed in her kitchen, now reduced to a name on a crime scene report. Her body had been discovered. The police had questions, but no answers. And as Monica tried to process the horror of it all, she did what any grieving mother would do. She fought. She took her sorrow and turned it into action. Within 24 hours, Monica Brooks was everywhere. News stations, community meetings, social media. Her voice trembled. Her eyes were swollen from days without sleep, but still. She stood in front of cameras, microphone in hand, pleading for justice. Someone knows something. Someone saw something. Alyssa was loved. She was bright. She had her whole life ahead of her. If you know anything, please come forward. The community rallied behind her. Flyers covered street poles. Facebook groups flooded with theories and well wishes. Candlelight vigils were planned in Alyssa's honor. And standing at Monica's side, supporting her every step of the way, was her son Jaden Brooks, a devoted friend, a grieving brother, a young man who had just lost someone he loved. Or at least, that's what everyone believed. In moments of deep tragedy, people reveal who they really are. They show their pain, their sorrow, their guilt. And Jaden Brooks was no different. At first, he played the part well, standing next to his mother at the vigils, head bowed, eyes full of tears. A boy lost in grief. But there were subtle signs, small cracks in the mask that only those who were watching closely would notice. A moment at the first vigil, Monica, standing in front of a crowd of mourners, clutching a photo of Alyssa, her voice shaking. She was just 22. She had so much left to do. Whoever did this, you need to know, we will find you. A sea of people nodded. Some wept. Others held their candles high, flickering lights in the darkness. But Jaden stood apart, his hands clenched in his pockets, his body rigid, his eyes unmoving. And then, for just a second, his gaze lifted, scanning the crowd, watching. Not in sadness, but as if he were searching for something. What was he looking for? Was it a familiar face? Someone who knew too much? Or was it simply the weight of his own secret, pressing down on him in a way that even he couldn't hide? What do you think? Tell us in the comments. Monica didn't see it then. She couldn't. Her mind was consumed by the hunt for Alyssa's killer. She met with detectives daily, pressing them for updates. But every lead seemed to go nowhere. Alyssa's phone records? Nothing unusual. Her apartment security cameras? No footage of anyone coming or going. Her closest friends? All alibis checked out. It was as if the killer had simply vanished into thin air. And yet, Monica refused to give up. She organized marches through the city. She spoke at community meetings, her voice raw, desperate. Alyssa was our daughter, our sister, our friend. We cannot let this case go cold. The public listened. They shared her posts. They passed out flyers. And all the while, Jaden stood by, watching his mother fight for the truth he already knew. There was one moment, one small, seemingly insignificant moment, that should have changed everything. A few nights after Alyssa's funeral, Monica sat at the kitchen table, exhausted. The house was dark, quiet. Jaden walked in. He poured himself a glass of water, and then he spoke. "Mom, do you think they'll ever find out who did it?" It was the way he said it. The way his voice wavered, just slightly. The way his eyes avoided hers as he lifted the glass to his lips, taking a sip that lasted a second too long. And Monica, tired, heartbroken, overwhelmed, missed it. She didn't see the guilt in his eyes. She didn't hear the fear behind his words. But looking back, she would remember. She would remember that moment for the rest of her life. Because when the truth finally surfaced, when Monica Brooks finally realized what had been standing right in front of her all along, she would never look at that night the same way again. She would never look at her son the same way again. Tell us, have you ever ignored a feeling deep inside you, only to realize later that it had been the truth all along? Let us know in the comments. Because for Monica Brooks, that feeling was coming. It was creeping closer, like a shadow she hadn't yet noticed. And when it finally caught up with her, it would destroy everything she thought she knew. The police worked tirelessly. The case had gripped the city, sending shockwaves through every neighborhood, every conversation. Who killed Alyssa Carter? Investigators followed every lead, chased every thread of possibility. Her ex-boyfriend? He had motive. The relationship had ended badly, bitter fights, lingering resentment. But on the night of her murder, he was miles away, caught on traffic cameras, confirmed by multiple witnesses. A stalker from her past? Alyssa had confided in friends about a man who had made her uncomfortable before, someone she had blocked, someone who had once sent her unsettling messages. But he had left town a year ago, a rock-solid alibi, placing him across the country when she died. A robbery gone wrong? The apartment hadn't been touched. Her phone was still there. Her laptop untouched. Nothing stolen. Nothing missing, except her life. Every theory led to a dead end. The killer wasn't a stranger in the night. The killer was someone she trusted. And then Monica Brooks started noticing something. Something small. Something easy to overlook. At first, she ignored it, brushed it away, convincing herself it was grief, stress, exhaustion. But the signs were there. Jaden wasn't acting right. He refused to talk about the case. Every time his mother brought up the investigation, he shut down, changed the subject, left the room. Monica thought he was just hurting. Alyssa had been his best friend. It made sense that he wouldn't want to relive the details. But there was something else, something deeper, a shift in his demeanor, a quietness that wasn't just grief, an unease that settled into his bones, like a weight he couldn't shake. The first time Monica really felt it, it was past midnight. She woke to a sound, something faint, something distant. At first, she thought it was in her dream. Then she heard it again, heavy breathing, a voice muffled, frantic. She got up, stepping quietly toward Jaden's room. The door was slightly open, and there he was, sitting up in bed, drenched in sweat, gripping his sheets like he was holding on to something real. His breath was ragged, his chest rising and falling in sharp, uneven bursts. A nightmare. Monica had seen her son restless before, but this was different. She almost went in, almost placed a hand on his shoulder, whispered his name like she had when he was little. But then he spoke. "No, stop." His voice was barely above a whisper, then a sharp inhale. His fingers tightened around the sheets. And then 2 words, spoken so softly, Monica almost convinced herself she imagined them. "I didn't mean to." Monica froze. Jaden jerked awake. His eyes darted to the doorway, to her. For a long moment, they just stared at each other, his breathing still uneven, his hands trembling slightly. Then he looked away, pulled the blanket up, turned his back. Monica opened her mouth, but the words never came. She should have asked, should have pressed him, should have recognized the truth staring her in the face. But she didn't. She turned, walked away, told herself it was just a bad dream. Have you ever ignored something right in front of you? Something your gut was screaming at you to see? What would you have done? Let us know in the comments. Then, a few days later, the scratches. Monica noticed them in the kitchen. Jaden had just finished breakfast, standing by the sink, rinsing his plate. And that's when she saw it. 3 deep, red scratches running down his forearm. Her brow furrowed. What happened to your arm? Jaden didn't even glance up. Basketball, a simple answer. Too quick. Monica hesitated. Looks deep. Jaden shrugged. It's nothing. And then he grabbed his keys and left. And for the first time, something settled in Monica's stomach. A feeling she couldn't name. Because Jaden hadn't played basketball in weeks. And deep down, something inside her was whispering. Those scratches, they weren't from a game. They were from a struggle. From fingernails digging into flesh. From someone fighting for their life. She should have said something. She should have confronted him. She should have asked a question she was too afraid to say out loud. But she didn't. Instead, she turned away. Told herself it was nothing. Because that was easier than facing the unthinkable. But the truth was creeping closer. And soon, Monica Brooks would no longer have the choice to ignore it. Because the next clue, the next moment that would shatter her world forever, it was already waiting for her, hiding in her own home. And when she finally found it, there would be no more running from the truth, no more pretending, no more lies. Stay with us. Because the moment Monica Brooks realizes what's been standing right in front of her will be the moment her entire life changes forever. The truth has a way of creeping in. It starts as a whisper, something faint, something distant. Then it lingers, wrapping around your thoughts, twisting in the corners of your mind, until suddenly it's right there in front of you, undeniable, unforgiving, unbearable. For Monica Brooks, that moment had finally come. She just didn't know it yet. It was late. The house was quiet. The city outside her window hummed with distant traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, the steady rhythm of life moving forward. But inside that home, inside Monica Brooks' heart, everything was beginning to unravel. She sat on the couch, staring at nothing, replaying the moments over and over again. The nightmare she had heard Jaden whispering about, the scratches on his arm, the way his hands shook when he thought no one was looking, the feeling, the one she had been pushing down, burying deep inside herself, was getting stronger. Something wasn't right, and tonight she was going to find out what it was. Monica walked down the hall. Jaden was out. She knew that much. His door was closed. She stood there for a moment, hand resting against the wood, debating. Then she stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of his cologne. Everything was neat, in place. But Monica wasn't looking for what was obvious. She was looking for what was hidden. Her hands moved carefully, searching, touching the things that had always been familiar, but now felt like secrets waiting to be uncovered. And then she saw it, in the far corner of his closet, shoved beneath a pile of old shoes and forgotten clothes, his gym bag. Something about it felt wrong. Monica knelt down, hesitated, then unzipped it. And inside, everything stopped. The first thing she saw was a hoodie. Dark fabric, stiff in places. She reached for it, fingers trembling as she pulled it out, and that's when she saw the stains. Dark, faded at the edges. Blood. Her stomach lurched. And then something else. A small, delicate chain tangled in the folds of the hoodie. Monica's breath hitched. She knew that necklace. She had bought it. She had watched Alyssa unwrap it on her 21st birthday, had smiled as the young woman pulled her into a hug and whispered, "Thank you, Mama Brooks. I love it." And now it was here, buried in her son's gym bag, stained with something she refused to name. She couldn't breathe. Her mind fought against the truth, clawing for another explanation, any explanation. But then her eyes landed on one last thing. A single piece of paper, crumpled, frantic handwriting scrawled across the surface. A note, and as she smoothed it out, she read the words that would shatter her world forever. "I didn't mean to do it, but I couldn't stop myself." Monica felt her hands go numb. Her legs threatened to give out beneath her. Because this wasn't just evidence. This wasn't just another clue in an unsolved case. This was a confession, a whisper from the past, a message from her son. And in that moment, Monica Brooks had to face the one question she had spent weeks avoiding. Could Jaden be the one who killed Alyssa? What would you have done in her place? If you found the one thing that could turn your entire world upside down, would you confront the truth or try to bury it? Tell us in the comments. Because Monica Brooks was about to make the hardest decision of her life, and nothing would ever be the same again. Some truths are impossible to accept. Some moments change everything forever. For Monica Brooks, the moment she found that gym bag, the moment she read that note, the moment she held Alyssa Carter's necklace in her trembling hands, it was the moment her world shattered. But she wasn't ready to face it. Not yet. She needed to hear it from him. She needed to hear the truth from her son's own lips. The house was silent. Monica sat in the dim glow of the kitchen light, her hands folded, her breath slow and controlled, too controlled. Her heart pounded, each second stretching longer than the last. She was waiting for the front door to open, waiting for the sound of Jaden's footsteps in the hallway, waiting for the moment that would decide the rest of her life. Then the lock clicked, the door creaked open, and Jaden Brooks stepped inside. He tossed his keys on the counter, moving through the house with the careless ease of a man with nothing to fear. He didn't notice his mother at first, didn't see the way she sat rigid, unmoving, didn't notice the small, folded note sitting in front of her, the necklace placed beside it, the blood-stained hoodie draped across the table. But when he did, he stopped. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Monica watched him, studied him. Jaden didn't move, didn't blink, and then he exhaled, a slow, careful breath. And that was the first thing Monica noticed. He wasn't surprised. He wasn't confused. He knew. And that was what broke her. "Where did you find that?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Monica didn't answer. She simply lifted the note, held it in the space between them, and then she read the words aloud. "I didn't mean to do it, but I couldn't stop myself." Silence. The kind of silence that suffocates. Then Jaden's voice cracked. "Mom, you don't understand." He tried to lie, tried to twist the story, tried to tell her it wasn't what it looked like. But Monica had been a mother for too long. She had seen Jaden lie about stolen candy, broken dishes, bad grades. And she knew this wasn't a lie he could keep up. "Tell me the truth." Her voice was steady, unshaken. Jaden looked away, his hands curled into fists. And then he broke. "Alyssa and I, We were together. Monica's chest tightened. It wasn't like what people thought. It wasn't just friends. We were seeing each other. A pause. A long pause. Monica's breath came slow, shallow, and Jaden was starting to shake. She was pulling away. His voice was uneven now, trembling at the edges. She didn't want to be with me anymore. Monica knew what was coming. She felt it before he even said it. But he had to say it. She said she was done with me. Another pause. Then his voice cracked. I didn't mean to, Mom. I swear, I didn't mean to. The words fell from his mouth, a confession and a plea all at once. She wouldn't listen. She wouldn't listen. His hands gripped his hair, his body shaking. She kept saying it was over. She said I was too much, that I was changing, that I scared her. And suddenly, Monica couldn't breathe, because now she saw it. All of it. The rage. The fear in Alyssa's eyes that Monica had never noticed before. The way Jaden had been so possessive, so intense. It had never been love. It had been control. And when Alyssa tried to take that control away, he snapped. Monica stared at her son, and for the first time in his life, she didn't recognize him. A mother's love is supposed to be unbreakable. It's supposed to survive anything. But at that moment, Monica Brooks felt something crack inside her. Because how do you love someone who has done something unforgivable? How do you look at your own child and see a monster? Jaden was still talking, still trying to explain, still trying to justify. She made me do it. She wouldn't stop talking. She wouldn't listen. I lost it. I didn't mean to, I swear. Monica's hands were shaking now, her vision blurred. And in that moment, she knew she had to make a choice no mother should ever have to make, because the truth was right in front of her now, and there was no turning back. If it were you, if you were standing in that kitchen, if the person you love more than anyone had just told you the unthinkable, what would you do? Would you protect them? Would you turn away? Or would you do the one thing that would break you forever? Would you pick up the phone and call the police? Let us know in the comments. Because Monica Brooks was about to make her choice. And the moment she did, nothing would ever be the same again. Some moments define a person. Some choices break them. For Monica Brooks, that moment had arrived. She had heard the confession. She had looked into the eyes of her son and seen the truth staring back at her. And now, she had to do the one thing no mother should ever have to do. She had to let him go. The air in the kitchen was heavy. Jaden was still standing there, his hands trembling, his breath uneven. His words echoed in the silence, hanging between them like a weight that could never be lifted. She made me do it. Monica couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her hands were ice cold, the shock settling into her bones. She had spent the last 24 years protecting this boy, loving him, raising him, and now, in the same house where she had once rocked him to sleep, where she had held him through fevers and nightmares, she had to make a decision, the hardest decision of her life. Her eyes flickered to the phone on the counter, just inches away. Her hands twitched. A mother's instinct is to protect. But what happens when the thing you're protecting is the very thing that took someone else's life? She reached for the phone. Her fingers hovered over the keypad. Then she dialed 911. The ringing felt like it stretched on forever. Then a voice. 911. What's your emergency? Monica tried to speak. Her mouth opened. No words came. Then finally, in a voice that wasn't her own, just a broken whisper of the woman she once was. My son, I think he killed her. The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional, but Monica wasn't. Her breathing was shallow. Her hands trembled against the receiver. Dispatcher, ma'am, is the suspect with you right now? A pause. A long, suffocating pause. Then, Monica, yes. Her voice cracked. He's my son. The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong to her, like they were coming from someone else. Because saying them out loud made it real. Dispatcher, ma'am, I need you to stay calm. Officers are on their way. Monica's throat tightened. Her eyes flickered to Jaden. He was staring at her now, watching, listening, understanding. And for the first time since that bloody night, he looked afraid. The next few minutes stretched into eternity. Monica stood frozen, the phone still in her hands, her ears ringing with the distant sound of sirens. Jaden's face shifted. Something passed through his eyes, something unreadable. Then his voice, small, hoarse. You called them? Monica swallowed, nodded. Jaden let out a shaky breath. His hands flexed at his sides. And then he laughed. It wasn't humor. It wasn't relief. It was something hollow, something broken. I always knew you'd pick them over me. Monica's heart clenched, because this was her son. This was her baby. And now she had just given him away. The sirens grew louder. Flashing lights painted the house in streaks of red and blue. Monica took a step back, pressing herself against the wall as the first loud knock shattered the silence. Police! Open the door! Jaden flinched, his jaw clenched, his body tense. For a moment, Monica thought, would he run? Would he fight? But then, he just stared at her. And in that moment, she saw something strange, something she never expected. It wasn't rage. It wasn't hatred. It was relief. The door burst open. Uniformed officers flooded the room, weapons raised, voices sharp. Hands up! Don't move! Monica pressed a hand to her chest, her breath catching in her throat. Jaden lifted his hand slowly. His face was unreadable now, expressionless, as if he had already made peace with what was coming. The cold, metallic click of handcuffs echoed through the house. And just like that, Jaden Brooks was no longer her son. He was a murder suspect, a killer, a case number. And as they led him toward the door, his head turned just slightly, just enough to meet his mother's eyes one last time. And the look he gave her, it would haunt her forever. By morning, the news had exploded. Headlines blared across every channel, every phone screen, every newspaper. Breaking news. Jaden Brooks arrested for the murder of Alyssa Carter. The city was stunned. People who had mourned beside him, people who had stood in candlelight vigils, whispering prayers, never knowing the killer stood beside them. They couldn't believe it. And Monica Brooks wasn't just the mother of the murderer. She was the woman who had turned him in. How could she do it? That was the question everyone asked. That was the whisper behind every closed door. Would you have done the same? Could you have? Could you have picked up that phone? Could you have looked into the eyes of the person you loved most in the world and said the words that would take them away forever? Tell us in the comments. Because Monica Brooks made her choice, and she would have to live with it for the rest of her life. The weight of justice is heavy. It does not ease its grip for grief. It does not pause for the shattered hearts left in its wake. And for Monica Brooks, justice was no longer just a concept. It was a punishment, a sentence, a reckoning. Her son, her own flesh and blood, was now a defendant in a courtroom that did not see him as a child, only as a murderer, and the world was watching. The trial of Jaden Brooks became more than just a case. It became a spectacle. News cameras lined the courthouse steps. Journalists dissected every moment, every detail, every piece of evidence that had led to this moment. The young man who once stood at candlelight vigils, mourning Alyssa Carter, now sat stone-faced at the defendant's table, accused of taking her life. And at the center of it all was Monica, a mother, a witness, a woman who had turned her own son over to the law and would now have to testify against him. Could you do it? Could you sit on that stand? Could you say the words that would send your child to prison for the rest of their life? Because Monica Brooks had no choice. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted Jaden Brooks not as a grieving friend, but as a killer hiding in plain sight. They revealed who he really was. And for the first time, Monica saw it. The things she had missed. The rage beneath the surface. The violence that had been building for years. A pattern of outbursts that she had explained away. A history of jealousy, control, and possessiveness. The prosecutor held up Jaden's text messages. Messages sent in the weeks before Alyssa Carter's murder. You don't get to just leave me. I see who you're talking to. Don't think I don't know. You're mine. Always have been. And then the final message, sent just hours before she was killed. We need to talk. Then came the testimony. Witness after witness took the stand. Friends, co-workers, people who had seen the warning signs. The rage that flared behind Jaden's eyes. The way Alyssa had started pulling away. The way she had told people she felt afraid. And then it was Monica's turn. She sat in the witness chair, her hands shaking, her eyes full of something even she couldn't name. And when the prosecutor asked the question, "Did your son confess to you?" the courtroom fell silent. The world waited. And then Monica Brooks spoke the words that would seal her son's fate. Yes, a gasp rippled through the room. Jaden sat motionless. And in that moment, the boy she had raised, the son she had once held in her arms, became a murderer in the eyes of the law. Could you have done it? Could you have spoken those words? Let us know in the comments. Because for Monica, there was no going back. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. 6 long hours where Monica Brooks sat in the cold courtroom, hands clenched in her lap, staring at nothing. She had already lost Alyssa. Now, she was waiting to see if she would lose Jaden forever. The doors opened. 12 strangers filed in. The room fell into stillness. And then the judge turned to the jury foreman. The words were clear, unshakable. Has the jury reached a verdict? A pause. A beat of silence that stretched into eternity. Then, "Yes, Your Honor." Monica held her breath. Jaden did not move. In the case of the state versus Jaden Brooks, we find the defendant guilty. A muffled cry echoed in the courtroom. Jaden stared ahead. His face was blank. Monica felt her body go numb. The judge's voice cut through the silence. "Jaden Brooks, you are hereby sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The gavel slammed, and just like that, it was over. Jaden was led away in handcuffs. Monica watched him go. He did not look at her. Not once. Because this wasn't just a mother watching her son walk away. This was the end of everything. Could you have done it? Could you have sat there, knowing the rest of your child's life was slipping away? Would you have fought? Would you have begged? Or would you have done what Monica Brooks did? Let him go. Let us know in the comments. Because Monica made her choice. And for the rest of her life, she would have to live with it. Justice had been served. The trial was over. The cameras had disappeared. The world had moved on, but Monica Brooks? She was trapped in the ruins of the life she once knew. Alyssa Carter was gone. Jaden Brooks was in prison. And the boy she had raised, the child she had loved more than anything, no longer existed. She had done what the law demanded, what justice required, what was right. But in doing so, she had lost everything. It took her 3 months to visit him, 3 months of waking up in an empty house, staring at the room that once belonged to her son, 3 months of silence, 3 months of walking past the front door, expecting to hear his voice, expecting to see him come home. But Jaden Brooks wasn't coming home. Not ever. And now, she was standing in a prison visitation room, waiting for the moment she had been dreading since the day she made the call. When they brought him in, Monica barely recognized him. The orange jumpsuit, the shackles around his wrists, the emptiness in his eyes. For a moment, she couldn't move. This was the same boy she had rocked to sleep, the child she had nursed through fevers, the teenager she had cheered for at basketball games. But this was a stranger, and he barely even looked at her. He sat down across from her. Monica's fingers trembled on the table. She opened her mouth. No words came. For a long time, they sat in silence. Then, finally, she spoke. "I love you, son." Her voice was soft, breaking. But I had to do the right thing. Jaden's gaze lifted. For the first time since he walked in, he looked at her, and in his eyes there was no rage, no hatred, only something distant, something unreadable. And then he spoke. "You never really knew me, did you?" Monica felt it like a knife. The final wound, the one she would never recover from. Because she knew he was right. She had loved him. She had protected him. She had given him everything. But in the end, she had never really known him at all. She stood up, her hands flat against the table. Jaden didn't move, didn't speak, didn't say goodbye. She turned, and with every step toward the door, the weight of what she had done pressed down on her. She had saved lives by stopping him. She had done what was right, but she had lost her son forever. Monica Brooks never went back. She never stepped foot inside that prison again. Jaden was gone, but Alyssa's memory, that remained. And Monica knew she couldn't change the past, but she could change the future. She dedicated her life to advocating for victims of domestic violence, speaking to young women about the signs of abuse, the dangers of control, the things she had missed in her own home. And every time she stood in front of a crowd, every time she spoke Alyssa's name, she carried the weight of her choice, because justice had been served. But at what cost? What would you have done? If it were your son, if it were your child, would you have picked up the phone? Would you have spoken the words that would send them away forever? Could you have lived with it? Tell us in the comments. Because Monica Brooks made her choice, and for the rest of her life, she would have to live with it. Some stories don't have happy endings. Some choices don't leave room for relief. Some decisions, once made, can never be undone. This is one of those stories. Monica Brooks never imagined her life would end up here. She never imagined that the baby she once cradled, the boy she once protected, the son she swore to love unconditionally, would one day become the monster she had been searching for. She never thought she would lose her son, but she did. Not to illness, not to an accident, not to time, but to his own actions. And in the end, justice had to be served. Jaden Brooks will never be free again. He will spend every day behind cold steel bars, a number in the system, a name whispered in hushed tones by those who once knew him. And Monica, she will never be free either. Because justice does not erase the pain. It does not heal the wounds left behind. It only serves to remind us of what has been lost. And for Monica Brooks, the cost of justice was everything. But now, we ask you, what would you have done if the truth was staring you in the face? If you had to choose between justice and love? If the person you raised, the child you swore to protect, was guilty of the unthinkable, would you have picked up the phone? Would you have spoken the words that would take them away forever? Would you have done what Monica Brooks did? Or would you have looked the other way? Tell us in the comments. Because justice is easy until it's your own flesh and blood on the other side of the law. Alyssa Carter never got the chance to live the life she dreamed of. Jaden Brooks never got the chance to become the man his mother hoped he would be. And Monica Brooks? She now walks through life with a name forever tied to both of them. The mother of a killer, the woman who turned in her own son, the mother who chose justice over love. Would you have made the same choice? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Because in the world of true crime, sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that hit closest to home.